Hello, this lesson is on rhythm. So let me define rhythm for you before we do anything else. Rhythm is the organization of musical sounds into patterns of time duration. Let me say that again. Rhythm is the organization of musical sounds into patterns of time duration. All that means is that when you have music, you have any musical sound, that sound lasts a certain length of time. It has a certain duration to it. So I could sing a short note, ba. Okay, that was short. That was a short duration, or I could sing a longer duration. Ba. Okay, they were the same pitch, but their durations were different. That means they had different rhythms. Rhythm is then organized in various ways to make music. So sometimes you'll have music that is almost all the same rhythm, like it's very like da 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 da. That's all the same rhythm. They were all the same duration. And other times you'll have something that the durations are all mixed up and have very different rhythms. More of a varied rhythmic aspect to it. So you can combine rhythm and basically in endless possibilities. It's like an infinite number of ways you could combine it, which is cool because it allows composers to do all kinds of different things, not just with the different pitches or the different instrumentation that they use, but also with rhythm. So it gives you that kind of a different aspect to the music, which is really cool. So, okay, so if I'm talking about it in terms, if I'm going to say, if I'm going to talk about the rhythm of something, I do use the term duration a lot. So I would say that first note that I sang had a shorter duration than the second note that I sang. And then that would be a way to refer to the rhythm without even having to get into any kind of specific like terminology for that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show you what some rhythms look like, and then I'll talk about like some terms that go along with that, and then we'll be able to talk just about how like they relate to each other and things like that. Okay, so looking here at the paper, I'm going to go ahead and draw rhythms for you. So let's see if we can get this. Okay, bear with me as I make up my own way of doing this with the camera, not with the rhythms. Okay, this is a whole note. It's just a circle. It's actually not quite a circle. It's kind of more of an oblong shape. And my handwriting isn't the best, but it gets the point across. A whole note is just a note head. Note head is the circle part of the note. So we would say it's just an open note head because it's not filled in. It just has white space in it. And we say this is a whole note. But if we wanted to, if we wanted something that took up half the duration of a whole note, we could split the whole note into two, like this. And we could have a note head, an open note head, but now this time we also have a stem. This part of the note is called a stem. So we say an open note head with a stem. This is called a half note. So a whole note can be divided into two half notes. That kind of makes sense because it's like math, like one divided into two halves. So you could probably see where this is going. If I have a whole note, or a half note, sorry, if I have a half note that I want to divide into two parts, I get a quarter note. Quarter note has a closed note head with a stem. If I want to split the quarter note into two, I could split it into two eighth notes. I'm going to do this twice because I want to show you two different ways to write eighth notes. So you can write it like that, like I just did there, or you can do two eighth notes like this. They're connected. Both of these rhythms are exactly the same. They're just notated in a different way. And there would be a reason, there are reasons that you might want to notate them one way or another, and we'll explain that as we go along in the course. But for now, it's good to just know that they're the same thing. Now, some more terminology. So these have closed note heads, circles all filled in. They have stems. Each one of these has a stem. The first two here, this little thing coming off the stem is called a flag. So we would say these eighth notes have flags. And these eighth notes don't have flags because they don't have that little hanging thing. Instead they have this. It's called a beam. And the beam joins the stems. Okay? So, note head, stem, flag, beam. I think it's easy to get some of these terms mixed up. So like the stem and the beam, right? But I always think of this like a stem comes up from the note head, just like a flower stem comes up from the ground. And a beam goes horizontal, just like a beam on a house does. So if you have a beam like holding up your roof, it goes this direction. So that's kind of how I remember that. Okay, so you can also split an eighth note into two and you get a 16th note. So what starts happening at this point is that you have the same idea with the flags, but you just add a flag. So that second flag shows it's half the duration of an eighth note. And I bet you know where this is going too. I can do flags, or let's say I split like this. I could have 16th notes with beams, and those are shown by having two beams, just like the 16th notes over here were shown with two flags. I could keep going. I could split these into 16th notes into 32nd notes, and they would have three flags or beams. I could split 32nd notes into 64th notes, and those would have four flags or beams. I'm not going to do that. You can imagine what those will look like, and if we come across them, we can talk about them. These are the most common rhythms that you will see. So that's a good place to start with this. We sometimes call this a rhythm tree, because if I were to split every one, it would kind of come down like a Christmas tree does. So that's just kind of a thing to know about that. Okay, so those are the basic rhythms, and that's basically what you need to know. Now you'll notice that I didn't say anything about what a beat is. I didn't say anything about how these sounds would be organized. I'm simply just teaching you how rhythms relate to each other. And that's because the concept of beat and the concept of organization and what kinds of notes get more emphasis than others, those things are actually issues of meter, and we will talk about meter really soon, like next week. But just make sure you don't get those two concepts confused. These rhythms can be done in lots of different ways. Meter is more about how the rhythms are organized to have a regularity to them. This is not really talking about that, it's more of a basic concept, so just so you're aware of that. Okay, so one other thing that I want to talk about in terms of rhythm before we go on to anything else. Okay, so something else with rhythms. Now the rhythms I just showed you don't necessarily always they don't tell you about all of the durations. Like those were all able to be split into two. But if you wanted like a third of a whole note or something like that, like you can't just show that with one of the notes that I gave you. So there are instances when you need to have durations that cannot be represented just by a single note by itself, by one of those single rhythms. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways that we can work with rhythms that don't fit into one of those nice neat little boxes. One way is by using ties. So for example, if I have a quarter note, oh, that's kind of fuzzy. All right, let me try. That's better. All right, sorry about that. If I have a quarter note and I want something to equal the duration of a quarter note plus an eighth note, I could do this. I could draw a quarter note and an eighth note and connect them with a tie. It looks kind of like a smiley face. They don't always look like that, but I like it when it works out that way. So the tie is just a line. It kind of connects both note heads and it's a little bit curvy. Sometimes stems come down from notes. So let's say I want to connect a quarter note to a whole note. I could do that. And now since the stem is coming down, I'm going to put the tie on the other side so it doesn't get too crowded. Okay. It's actually important that you're intentional with the way that you notate things, the way that you draw your notes. So I made a little joke earlier about my handwriting with notes not being great. It's not great, but I really try to make it clear. And so I don't expect yours to be perfect, but I do expect it to be clear. There's no question here of what I mean about these notes, and the note heads are fairly similar in size and shape. Same with this one. If you have stems coming up, they should always come up from the right side. If you have stems coming down, they should always come down from the left side. Of course, the whole note, there are no stems, so that's just fine like it is. If you have a note with a flag, yeah, this is an important one. So if I have a note with a flag here, with the stem going up, and the flag comes off to the right. If I have a note, an eighth note here with a stem going down, the flag still goes to the right. So no matter what, you always have your flags going to the right, almost like there's a little breeze coming from the left side, blows the flags this way. Now I wrote this note here. We could actually tie that note also. So if I was going to play these durations, this would sound like the duration of a quarter note plus an eighth note. I would not play this eighth note separately. It would just last longer. And same with this. This note would be the duration of a quarter note plus a whole note plus an eighth note. I would not re-strike the note at any of these points. I would strike the note here, and then it would last the whole time. If I wanted to make it last even longer, I could add more rhythms and keep tying them as much as I wanted. Now this does look a little sloppy or confusing, but depending, this might actually be a good rhythm to write. Now if I wanted something to last, let's say I wanted something to last the duration of a half note, I could also write this something like this, you know? Something like that. If I look back at my rhythm tree, this is correct. If I held a note for this long, the space of 4 eighth notes, it would be the same as holding it for the space of 1 half note. But this is a really complicated way to write it. This is much clearer to read. So when we think about issues of notation, we always want to think about someone who might be performing this music. What's the clearest way for them to be able to perform the music? Because performing is hard enough without having notational issues just cluttering it up. This is a lot of ink. It's a lot to look at and think about when you're in the middle of playing something or singing something. But this is a lot cleaner and it's a lot easier to figure out what's supposed to happen in terms of the rhythm. So if I had a choice between these two, I would choose the clearer one. Now, there might be an instance where this would be more appropriate, but it's going to be pretty rare. This is more often the way that you would want to show that. One other way that you can show a little bit of a longer note without using a tie, if you want a note to sound like it's last for its duration plus another half as much. So for example, this here has a quarter note plus an eighth note. The eighth note is half of a quarter note. So this is like a 1.5 quarter note length. I could show that same relationship with a dot. So the dot means add twice as much. Sorry, let me say that again because that was totally wrong. The dot means add half as much of the note that we just had. So a quarter note with a dot is a quarter note plus whatever half of a quarter note is, which is an eighth note. Okay, so think about this one. If I have a half note with a dot, actually we call this a dotted half note. If I have a dotted half note, what is the duration of that? Well, a half note to start with, plus whatever half of a half note would be a quarter note. So I could show that with a tie if I wanted to, or I could show it with a dot. And if you think about what I just said about notation, which one is cleaner? This one or this one? Well, there might be an instance where I'd want to use the tie, but actually the dot is a little neater. It takes up less ink, there's less to look at. My brain can kind of process this a little bit more quickly. So dots are used whenever you have the specific kind of relationship, like a note plus half its duration, and that's how long you want the note to last. Use a dot. Otherwise, you have to use the ties because there's no other way to show that relationship. Okay, one more thing and then we're done. I'm just kidding, I lied. Two more things, but they're quick. Okay. You can add a dot to a dot. You could have a doubly dotted quarter note. That's what we call that. Now, that doesn't mean a quarter note plus 2 eighth notes. It means a quarter note plus half, which is an eighth note, plus half of the dot. So this dot refers back to this dot. So half of the dot would be a 16th note. So that is what this duration is. And you could continue adding dots, and every dot just refers to the dot before it. So whatever half of a 16th note is, we could add another dot, and we could add that much duration to it. So you can't have more than one dot. Okay. Now you'll notice that never in any of this have I talked about how fast any of these rhythms are. I've been talking about their relationship to each other, but I haven't been talking about their relationship to actual time, like clock time. So, like I said, it doesn't tell us about organization, and that's meter, but it doesn't also does not tell us about speed, and that's tempo. So tempo is the speed at which a piece of music moves. Tempo talks about how fast a piece is. So if I had, a quarter note, and if I had 3 quarter notes and 2 eighth notes, and I went ta, 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 that would be a rhythm, okay? And I did that at a certain tempo, kind of a moderate tempo. I could do it a lot slower. Ta, 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 ta. It was still the same rhythm, but it had a different tempo. It was a lot slower in terms of the tempo. So those are two separate things, and it's important to know the difference between that. Rhythm doesn't necessarily make something fast or slow, depending on the tempo. It has a lot to do with that too. Okay, this concludes our video on rhythm, and feel free to email me with any questions, and hopefully this all is making sense, and you can go ahead and try to write some of these rhythms on your own. Just make sure that you're working on your notation, that everything is clear and readable, and I'm using pen to make it show up a little bit better, but you might want to use pencil, so that way if you make mistakes you can erase them, especially when you're doing homework. It can be really helpful. So, alright, I will see you soon.